to connect with spirit, to facilitate communications with ancestors, astral projection, for healing and past life exploration. Psychospirituality offers a doorway to things that are outside the scope of our conventional knowledge. And there's been contemplated debate as to what role psychedelics play in the development of religion, if any. There was a long-standing ritual in ancient Greece from 1450 BC to 400 CE, which included a psychedelic beverage they refer to as kykeon. The exact contents are not known still. The festival became known as the Eleusinian Mysteries, and they were referred to as mysteries because all were welcome, but none were allowed to speak of the experience upon threat of death. The Eleusinian Mysteries were one of the Greco-Roman mystery religions. Participants, including Roman emperors like Marcus Aurelius, would travel to Athens for week-long festivities. Greek lore tells of the festival association with myth and agriculture. Some say it stems from a story about a mother and a daughter, Persephone. The daughter was taken by Hades to the underworld, and through some complicated bargaining with Zeus, she was allowed to come back to her mother, Demeter, a few times a year. The daughter's return coincided with the seasons and cycle of rebirth in spring and death in winter. And the ritual festival continued for almost 2 centuries. And it's been documented by Plato, Aristotle, and Cicero. This is really our first foray into psychedelics used in a large festival religious type organization. Throughout history, psychedelic compounds do play a role in both science and religion. Current research indicates some of the most significant transformative experiences are the result of mystical experiences. While the research and study of these compounds is necessary to understand how they can be used, as we medicalize them, there's the element of sacred that may get lost in the process. There's evidence of ceremonial mushroom use depicted in pre-Columbian artwork in North and South Americas, Africa, and Europe. In 1591, we see the first published account of peyote, and in 1799, the first psychedelic mushroom experience was documented. 1851, ethnobotanist Richard Spruce documented his experience with ayahuasca, and 1893, peyote use was described in scientific trials. Now we jump to Switzerland, 1938, where chemist Albert Hofmann, who was working to synthesize a compound to affect cardiovascular and respiratory processes, created LSD accidentally. It wasn't ideal for his purpose, so he shelved the compound. And years later, in 1943, he was re-examining the compound and he accidentally absorbed some through his fingertips, and he had the first synthetic psychedelic trip. On April 19th, Dr. Hoffman rode his bicycle home from work, and he later described his experience. That day had become known as Bicycle Day. This early discovery of synthetic psychedelic compounds opened up the door to a whole new paradigm of consciousness. The 1960s were a fertile time in the development of consciousness, expansion, and psychedelia, used both for personal, spiritual gain, creativity, connections, healing. But as we're learning and have, psychedelics are a sharp tool and must be used with care. Psychedelics were seen by the government as a military tool. In 1953, the CIA used them in the development of a project referred to as MK Ultra, giving LSD to unwitting subjects and subjecting them to a variety of procedures to see if they could be brainwashed or broken. I think there also was some hint of that in The Manchurian Candidate, the movie from back in the day. In 1957, there was a businessman named Gordon Wasson. He and his wife traveled to Mexico, and they had to experience a psychedelic ceremony hosted by a curandero named Maria Sabina. Maria's condition to host this mushroom ceremony was that Wasson would keep the experience close to his heart. Wasson came back to America and he published his experiences in Life magazine, bringing him accolades and notoriety. But Wasson's publicity of the experience sent waves of psychedelic tourists to this small community where Maria lived, exposing the sacred. There was a lot of fallout, and the community members blamed Maria for bringing these psychedelic tourists, and her house was burnt down. Maria because she's passed, a sacred relationship to healing and mushrooms. She called them her little children, and she offered her ceremonies in a non-transactional manner. And there's so much commodification and commercialization these days, right now, as we're talking about bringing these medicines into our society. So I also always like to honor the importance of respecting the plants and the teachers who came before us and committed themselves to this relationship with healing plants and arts. Philosophical conversations muse that these sacred plants are presenting themselves in our current human consciousness as a desperate request to have us as humans develop a more appreciative relationship, both with ourselves and the earth. Okay, so a little on poetry. Psychedelics were largely used in therapeutic modalities. There was a psychiatrist named Dr. Humphrey Osmond, who was working to understand psychosis and treat alcoholism. And he used psychedelics, which were referred to as psychomimetics, because they mimicked psychotic experience. And Dr. Osmond, he shared some of his LSD experiences with a few notable scholars like Aldous Huxley. So in a letter between friends, Aldous Huxley writes, "To make this trivial world sublime, take 0.5 gram of phentermine." And Humphrey Osmond writes back, "To fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic." And that's the first time the word was used. That's really the coining of the phrase, psychedelic. Aldous Huxley is known for writing The Doors of Perception. He describes the benefits in a lot of these really cool books about the benefits of awakening us to the sacred. He also writes about the dangers of a progress-driven society and the value of psychedelic substances to help remind us of the potential to create a human society driven by equanimity. To all of his psychedelic experiences, there's photographic history taken, and he's always the one guy he's like a Brit in his buttoned up 3-piece wool suit while everybody else is wearing their smooth hippie clothes. On his deathbed, he took 100 milligrams of LSD given to him by his wife, and he transitioned with a smile, which was documented in a book his wife Laura wrote called This Timeless Moment. There's a story in the book about how she was at the bedside with him and the friends were in the front room and the TV was on. And as the actual death transition happened for Aldous, Laura recognized there was a hush over the entire house. And she thought, oh, they must all be super tuned in. But she came out into the room, and it was at that moment that JFK was shot. And they were all just dumbstruck watching television. Dr. Humphrey Osmond had also shared these experiences with Bill Wilson, the founder of Alcohol Anonymous. Bill Wilson found psychedelic treatment to be really helpful and transformative for addiction. However, as we know, politics of the time did not allow for the continued collaboration. Psychedelics in Recovery is a 12-step program that can be found online. In 1960, Tim Leary, Ralph Metzner, and Richard Alpert, who later became known as Ram Dass, began working together as part of the Harvard Psilocybin Project. Collectively, they were engaged in a few experiments exploring the benefits of psychedelics. The Concord prison experiment was one offering psychedelics along with supportive therapy to the inmates of the Concord prison system to assess for reduced recidivism rate. The Marshall Chapel experiment, also known as the Good Friday experiment, was an opportunity to offer psilocybin to divinity students to explore if it would increase capacity for spiritual growth. Houston Smith was one of the divinity students at the time. He went on to author a textbook on comparative religion and contemplative studies. They talk a little bit about the active versus control group, and they are open-minded divinity, spiritual beings to begin with. So when they came into the chapel, the control group thought they were the active group because they were feeling really connected. But then when the next group came in and they were naked and half of them were crying and laughing, it became clear who actually was the active group. To assess for the efficacy, Walter Pankey, a graduate student involved in the Good Friday experiment, was updating a mystical rating scale originally developed by William James to measure. He used elements of this scale. Noetic quality is an important one. That's refers to as the feeling of profound insight or intuitive knowledge, just knowing. Positive mood, unity, a sense we are all one, we're all connected. A sense of transcendence of time, space, and infinite realm. Sacredness. Ineffability defies words. These experiences are so vast and nonlinear, we just can't really explain them. As well as paradoxicality, which is a reconciliation of opposites, everything and nothing. 25 years later, Rick Doblin followed up with these research participants, and he found that all but one felt this singular experience had been one of the high points of their spiritual life. 1963 to 1974, psychiatrist Dr. Stanislav Grof was responsible for about 4,500 LSD-assisted therapeutic interventions. When psychedelics were reclassified as no longer available for research or treatment, Dr. Grof leaned into accessing non-ordinary states of consciousness through other means, developing holotropic breathwork. In 1967, Salvador Roque, a Mexican psychiatrist, developed a psychedelic-assisted individual and group therapy practice. He was well known for non-conventional group therapy and would use a variety of drugs in combination: LSD, mushrooms, ketamine, mescaline, and other substances. He called these psychosynthesis. He would curate these groups with loud noises and noxious visuals and create a really distressing environment for people to be pushed to the edge, break down, and come back. It was very controversial, as was his entire career, and he did spend quite a few years behind bars. As you can see, the decades from 1950 to 1970 were rich with clinical and therapeutic use of psychedelics in the healing arts. But in 1970, psychedelics were deemed drugs of abuse with no medicinal or research benefits. This was a politically driven movement in response to socio-cultural changes. And as a result, the psychedelic research was all halted. This ban on controlled substance included indigenous medicines used by Native Americans who had to fight for religious freedom. And in 1978, the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was enacted. Unfortunately, Westerners curious to seek out a peyote experience have compromised the cactus supply, which has become endangered, which has also happened as a result of the uptick in DMT and 5-MeO which is also known as bufo, to the mistreatment of frogs, which is where we get the venom from, which is psychoactive. MDMA was first synthesized in 1912 and then reintroduced into their community by renegade biochemist Alexander Sasha Shulgin. Shulgin built a lab in his backyard and developed creative freedom for himself. He ended up friends with some DEA agents, but he really worked underground. He experimented with small groups of friends. He would create these vast drugs and give them to his friends, and he had legal pads, and he'd walk around and asking, like, okay, if 0 is baseline, are you 3+, 2+, 1+? And they would work together to decide like what drugs did what, and then he'd go back to the bench and tweak them accordingly. He's got meticulous notes, and he shared them in these 2 books, Fickle and Thickle. Fickle actually stands for phenylalanines I've known and loved, and the other one is tryptamines I've known and loved. They're really thick books. I didn't read Fickle, but Fickle, the first half of it is like 400 pages of a love story between him and his wife, Anne. And he talks about, their love story, as well as recounting a lot of different group experiments with drugs together. But the whole back half of the book is like reading a dictionary. It's just a glossary of drugs and terms. So it was really hard. That part was quite difficult to read. Sasha also gave MDMA to a psychologist by the name of Leo Zeff, who shared it with clients as well as clinicians. It was used primarily for couples therapy and to enhance empathy and group communication. MDMA was really often used in the 70s and 80s legally and therapeutically until, again, it was reclassified as a drug with no medical or research benefit in 1985. This book, The Secret Chief, was written, and now he's out because he's passed, but it was only after he died that the Secret Chief became clear that it was Dr. Leo Zeff. Frustrated by lack of access to these meds, in 1986, which is a year after MDMA was reclassified, Rick Doblin formed MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies, which is an organization committed to furthering the research of MDMA and psilocybin for the treatment of addiction and mental well-being. Psychedelic research was silenced for about 20 years until 1990, when psychiatrist Rick Strassman gave DMT to healthy volunteers. DMT later became referred to as the spirit molecule. It's a naturally occurring molecule released by the pineal gland in the brain at the time of death. And near-death experiences are presumed by some to be the effect of large amounts of DMT released in the brain. However, this remains unconfirmed. But once the door was opened by Dr. Strassman's experiment, the renaissance of the psychedelic research really blossomed, and so many things happened in so many different localities. I don't know if localities is a word, locations. So here's like a really brief, non-comprehensive overview. There are so many highlights of when big research happened. In 1993, Dave Nichols created the Hefner Institute in New Mexico, researching psychedelics, primarily mushrooms, in the treatment of mental health. In 1999, Johns Hopkins University opened up the psychedelic research program, driven by the emphasis of Dr. Roland Griffith. In 2011, Dr. Charlie Grove, who's a mentor of mine, published research demonstrating psilocybin's efficacy in reducing anxiety in patients with advanced cancer. He's done and is still actively involved in multiple studies using psilocybin for reactive anxiety in cancer patients. Grove also spent decades in the 90s in Brazil exploring ayahuasca and its benefit communally on the mindset of people engaging in a regular ayahuasca practice were pro-social, had less depression and less drug and alcohol abuse. Sorry, that was a quick aside. In 2017, FDA granted breakthrough therapy designation, and we got the approval for phase 3 trial with MDMA. In 2019, ketamine was also reclassified as a medication to treat treatment-resistant depression, and the FDA granted breakthrough therapy status for psilocybin and depression. And in 2021, the NIH, for the first time in 50 years, began to support research into the psychedelic medicine space. That's a sample from academia, which doesn't even touch on the centuries of experiential treatment and research that has been going on across the globe in a variety of cultures, tribes, cities, and communities. Internationally, there are over 1,000 clinical trials producing promising results that showcase the benefit of using psychedelic medicines for the treatment of addiction and mental health disorders, shifting the paradigm from Western psychotherapists and psychiatrists spent a lot of time suppressing symptoms. And now with this transformational healing model, our goal is to get to the root cause and make actual sustained change. In this diagram, you can see that psilocybin is actually a prodrug, and it's converted to psilocin in the body. And psilocin is really, really similar to serotonin on a molecular level. But the treatment approach to how we use it is quite different. MDMA is on the path to approval by the DEA, and I'm following the current research. It seems like 2024, next year, it will be available and prescribed in multidisciplinary clinics. MAPS is training thousands of therapists to treat clients with PTSD using MDMA facilitated therapy. MDMA and psilocybin protocol is really long and intense. Annie and Michael Mithofer and the MAPS team co-created and teach this modality. Cumulative therapy for the research is about 42 hours, and a lot of time is dedicated to therapy and relational healing. Way more time is dedicated to that than actual time in medicine space. An overview of what the process looks like is it starts with an initial assessment to assess one's appropriateness for treatment. There are a number of preparatory sessions to build trust, discuss intentions, as well as prepare individuals for the journey. The therapists are mindful of set, which is your mindset of the client, and setting, which is the physical space. Creating a relationship where a client feels safe is paramount. It's this non-ordinary state of consciousness that can be both scary as well as an opportunity for profound transformational experiences. It really allows us to have a shift in perspective and see things from a much different perspective, and then hold on to that change through continued therapy. The medicine session can be 8+ hours long, intense for both clients as well as clinicians, which is why it's often done in dyads. And integration, kind of a fancy word for therapy, an ongoing process that allows for momentary glimmers of light, insight to develop into sustained change. And integration doesn't necessarily have to be verbal. There's a lot of, as we know from Bessel van der Kolk's work, there's a lot of trauma that gets held in the body that is pre-verbal or not processed through speaking about our stories. So oftentimes body work and or energetic work is quite helpful for the integrative process. MAPS is actually completed their 3rd phase clinical trial, and the results indicate that 67% of the people that went through the trials no longer tested positive for symptoms of PTSD. Psilocybin, that Bill 58 was just passed to decriminalize psilocybin here in California and in a number of other areas in the States. The path for approval is pending a bit more clinical trials. The research and potential application for these compounds is really vast, as indicated here in the list. Everything from anxiety, PTSD, depression, eating disorder, autism, conflict resolution, group therapy, addiction, childhood developmental trauma, but like bigger group, isms can be addressed with MDMA on board because it can reduce our blood flow to the amygdala, which is really the house of fear and anger, and it increases oxytocin, therefore increasing empathy and compassion. We would then find a nice, I have a vision where we use this for groups talking about racism, and other socially unjust things that happen to us institutionally and socially. The gateway for these tools is diagnostically specific, though, because we have to stay within the research model to get the green light. So ketamine entered through the treatment-resistant depression doorway, MDMA for PTSD, and psilocybin for both depression, addiction, and the most common studies, or most of the studies, have been existential anxiety associated with death from an impending illness. Historically, our treatment for mental health has been looking at mind and behavior. And as we evolve our understanding of the mind and consciousness, we're recognizing how much more there is, how we store all of these traumatic experiences in our body, inviting us to change the way we think about treating trauma and addiction. Some recommended readings, I imagine you probably all know about Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, Pilo Levine's The Waking Tiger, and both stand on the shoulders of Wilhelm Reich, a contemporary of Freud and founder of body psychotherapy. Psychedelics are non-specific amplifiers, and at times during psychedelic healing session, what's ready to present itself bioenergetically rises to the surface. So all of the training that people get with what is Stanislav holotropic breath work does a lot of body and somatic work. We do see a lot of somatic work come out of that. And there's a lot of good training with somatic work for the body's response to psychedelic healing. As clinicians and caregivers, we're examining life and consciousness through this scientific lens at times. Psychedelics affect the lens, allowing us to see from new and different perspectives. I see psychedelics as an invitation for us to contemplate how we think about ourselves and the world around us, looking through a compassionate lens. And I feel optimistic that we're on a healthier path towards wholeness. That is the whole thing. Now I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Oh, stop share. Okay. Does anybody have any questions or comments? I kind of feel psychedelic healing and psychedelic medicine invites like a more Socratic method of conversation. So you don't even have to have a straight up question, just like comment stuff we can process together is invited. Max, yeah, you raise your hand.
Yeah, you mentioned the use of psychedelics to address more root causes and heal those. And it's interesting to integrate that into a societal perspective versus and like healing the planet, right? Because a lot of the symptoms that we see in individuals are more flowing from systemic illness.
Totally. And also, how about if we heal somebody in like the bubble of an office and then you put them back into like a sexist, racist, ageist community? So I feel like there's so much opportunity for us here.
I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on that. Hi, I'm Carrie. I am a Antioch MFT master's graduate, and I've just entered my PhD program. And my area of interest and research is from a social justice focus on, actually, this is so great because it's for treatment of treatment-resistant chronic relapsing addiction,
Yeah.
and making that treatment equitable and accessible to all. And particularly with psychedelics, there is a thought that they are for the elite, they are for the privileged. And it's been taken out of the, let's see, I want to manage my words here, but taken out of the spiritual healing perspective and being monetized in those ways.
Yeah.
So I'm really curious as to your thinking around that social justice approach, as you just mentioned. Like, how do we make these treatments accessible? What is your vision for the future? What would you like to see? How are you imagining it?
Groups and in community, like there's also